Kayamika sat under the mango tree outside her mother's mud house, her fingers carefully underlining a verse in her worn-out Bible, its cover peeling but pages still whole. She had just finished her morning chores, fetching water, sweeping, and helping Mama Grace slice okra for the market, when Obinna arrived with his usual swagger. He was handsome, tall, and brown-skinned, with a beard that villagers whispered made him resemble the Nollywood actors on posters pasted by the road. He carried himself like a man who would soon make it in life, but his pride was louder than his potential. "Still reading that book?" he teased, pointing to her Bible like it was a children's toy. Kayamika smiled softly. "It's not just a book, Obinna. It's my strength." But her gentle tone only provoked more laughter. "Ah, strength," he barked, looking around as if calling witnesses. "This your strength has kept you in this same wrapper since last year." His friends, gathered near the village football pitch, roared in agreement. Kayamika's heart sank, but she said nothing. She had learned that in a world where pride was loud, silence often said more. Despite his mockery, Obinna kept coming back, not out of love for her prayers, but because Kayamika was everything a man like him wanted when he grew tired of the flashy girls. She cooked with warmth, listened without interrupting, and never asked him for anything but honesty. Deep inside, Kayamika held on to hope that Obinna would change, that maybe one day he would join her in night prayers or follow her to the revival programs where souls danced under candlelight. But even during those moments of closeness, Obinna would scoff whenever she laid her Bible on the bed. He once whispered, "Are we three in this relationship? Me, you, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John." Still, Kayamika prayed for him. She prayed with her whole chest. She believed love was patient, that love covered shame, and that even the most wayward heart could be redirected. But the signs were there. He would disappear for days, returning with perfume she never wore on him, lies clumsily stitched together, and excuses about business trips to Enugu. Mama Grace warned her once, but Kayamika said, "Love is a cross, Mama. I'm willing to carry it." What she didn't know was that Obinna was not only carrying secrets. He was nursing contempt. To him, Kayamika's kind of woman was for temporary suffering, not for permanent status. He admired her resilience, but never respected it. He thought her faith made her weak, submissive, too grounded for his imagined life in Lagos. At beer parlors, he would brag to his friends that his woman could quote the entire Bible, but didn't even own a second pair of slippers. "Nah, wife be that," he would sneer. "She day quote Psalms, but she no sabi slay." The more Kayamika loved, the more he mocked. And like a seed planted in dry soil, the relationship began to shrivel, not from lack of water, but from absence of mutual vision. Yet she stayed, not out of desperation, but from conviction. She told herself that sometimes God gives you rough wood to carve into glory. But she didn't know that some would resist shaping. Some must be burned before light comes. St. Anthony's Community Church was nothing more than a zinc-roofed hall with dusty plastic chairs and a single standing fan that groaned louder than the choir. But to Kayamika, it was the only place in the entire village where her soul breathed freely. That was where she met Damien, a poor orphan boy with a cracked voice who led worship with closed eyes and trembling hands. He wore the same oversized shirt every Sunday, sleeves rolled up and frayed at the collar. But when he lifted his voice in worship, even the loudest gossip in church fell silent. Damien wasn't just a singer. He was broken and humble, and it showed in his prayers. "God, I don't have a father, but you are my everything," he once prayed aloud during a youth service, and Kayamika remembered crying into her Bible. They grew close through morning prayers and scripture memorization. He helped her arrange hymnals. She helped him prepare opening prayers. They talked about destiny, about trusting God through storms, and even when they had nothing to eat, they fasted, not out of discipline, but because they had no choice. Obinna hated Damien with a burning subtlety. He laughed whenever Kayamika mentioned him and referred to him sarcastically as Pastor No Shoes. One day, while passing by the church, Obinna saw Damien sweeping the compound barefoot and called out mockingly, "Ah, Pastor, may the Lord bless your broom ministry." Damien didn't answer, but Kayamika did. "Obinna, please," she said gently. "He's helping God's house." Obinna scoffed. "And God go give him house too?" The sarcasm cut deep, but Damien smiled. He was used to insults, just as Kayamaka was used to silence. But somewhere in their shared humility, a sacred friendship blossomed, not romantic, but one that echoed the kind of respect rarely found even in marriages. Damien saw the grace in Kayamaka and treated her like a queen, even when her wrappers were faded and her sandals had holes. He would often say, "The people who laugh at your faith today will sit in the crowd to clap when God lifts you." Kayamaka would nod and whisper, "Amen," not knowing she was hearing a prophecy. But the deeper their friendship grew, the more Obinna grew cold. He accused Kayamaka of having secret feelings for her church boyfriend, even though she denied it with tears. He stopped escorting her to midweek services and began openly mocking her at home. Once, when she returned from choir practice with cassava flour for dinner, Obinna looked at her and said, "Is it that boy who gave you this Gary? Abi, he's now your provider." She froze. "Obinna, it's from Mom and Ketchy. She gave it to me." But he had already turned away, muttering, "You and that beggar boy go marry yourselves in that your zinc church. Let me look for a woman that knows life." It was in those moments that Kayamaka realized her heart was no longer safe in her own home. The man she once loved had become a stranger, and the friend she once served God with had become her only human anchor. Their wedding was small, rushed, and mostly sponsored by Kayamaka's church. Her mother sold her last plot of cassava to buy the cheapest lace material, while Damien led the worship in tears. The day felt more like an escape than a celebration, an attempt to keep a crumbling man from running too far. But Kayamaka told herself it was the beginning of something sacred, that marriage would change Obinna, that maybe now he would stop mocking God and start embracing the love she carried. But the honeymoon phase was brief, almost imaginary. From the first week, Obinna resumed staying out late, returning with liquor breath and dry excuses. He would drop his phone on the bed face down, claim his battery was dead, and snore through prayers. Kayamaka, still believing in the covenant, would kneel beside his sleeping body every night and whisper prayers on his behalf. "Father, give him peace. Touch his heart. Make him love you." But it felt like heaven had gone silent, watching her cry through her makeup. Kayamaka tried everything. She cooked, cleaned, fasted, smiled through insults, and even gave up her Sunday choir to make time for her husband's needs. But nothing satisfied him. If the soup was too salty, she was useless. If it was too bland, she was kitchen illiterate. When she asked if they could have morning devotions, he laughed. "My friend, this is not your prayer retreat. We're not in church." The only time Obinna paid attention to her was when she wore her wrapper tightly enough to appeal to his lust. Even then, it was mechanical. He would roll away afterward and scroll on his phone, often texting Gozi. Though Kayamaka didn't know that yet. She only saw the smile on his face change. She only felt her body begin to carry shame, like she was being used as punishment for being good. Still, she held on. Her pastor once said, "Your marriage is your ministry." But she was starting to realize ministry without partnership was suffering dressed in religion. Worse still, her friends had begun to whisper, "Why doesn't Obinna ever come to church? Was he not the one that danced with Ngozi at that burial? Are you sure you're okay?" But Kayamaka smiled and said, "God is working." Only Damien saw through her makeup and praise and worship smile. One evening, after a midweek prayer meeting, he pulled her aside and asked, "Is Obinna hurting you?" She couldn't answer. Her lips trembled and her eyes filled. She said nothing and walked away. That night, when Obinna returned from his meeting, drunk and demanding dinner, she served him his food, knelt beside the table, and whispered in her heart, "Lord, if this is the path you chose, give me strength to walk it. But if this is not of you, remove me gently." She did not know the removal would come violently. The day started like any other. The morning sun pierced through the raffia curtains as Kayamaka swept the compound with a tired rhythm, singing softly to herself. Her body ached from last night's confrontation with Obinna, who had stumbled and drunk again, muttering things she didn't understand. He barely touched the food she served and passed out on the bed. By dawn, he was gone. No word, no apology. Kayamaka sighed, clutching her Bible against her chest as she sank onto the plastic chair outside. She had begun to notice his patterns, disappearing for days, returning with expensive perfumes, phone calls taken outside, and the growing coldness in his eyes when she mentioned God. That evening, she decided to take dinner to his workplace, a small local car wash she managed, hoping food and warmth would bring him back home. But Obinna wasn't there. The only worker on duty said, "Ogasay make I no disturb am. E day rest with madam." Kayamika didn't understand, until she saw Ngozi's car parked at the back of the compound. The sight of her cousin's gold-painted Toyota Corolla wasn't enough to accuse, until she stepped closer and heard laughter. And then Obinna's voice. And then the unmistakable giggle of Ngozi, the same cousin who had once teased Kayamika for marrying a broke man who drinks ogogoro like water. With shaking hands, Kayamika tiptoed to the tinted window of the back office. Through the small opening where the curtain didn't fully close, her heart stopped. There was Ngozi, sitting on Obinna's lap, his hands tracing her thighs as they shared a bottle of fruit wine and chips. "Your wife no go vex," Ngozi teased. Obinna laughed hard and replied, "That one? She day do vigil with Holy Spirit. She no sabi anything." The laughter that followed stabbed Kayamika deeper than any blade could. She staggered backwards, the food flask slipping from her trembling hands, crashing on the concrete. The sound startled them. Footsteps approached. The office door flung open, and there they stood. Obinna in boxers, Ngozi in an oversized shirt, both frozen at the sight of her. Kayamika didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply turned around, tears blurring her vision, and began to walk away barefoot, having removed her sandals to approach quietly. "Kiamakavait." Obinna called, annoyed more than guilty. She paused. "You said marriage was ministry," she whispered, facing him. "But I didn't know you were worshipping another altar." Ngozi rolled her eyes and muttered, "Not prayer woman full this village." Then Obinna, instead of apologizing, stepped forward and slapped her, a sharp, hot slap that knocked her against the wall. "Get out," he shouted. "Carry your Bible and go and pray. Maybe your God will make me faithful." Her knees bled, but she didn't stop him. She rose slowly, picked up the scattered rice with trembling fingers, and walked home with a broken flask in her arms like it was a child. That night, she lay on the floor and prayed through the pain. But this time, her voice shook differently. This time she said, "Lord, is this still my cross, or am I crucifying myself?" The church compound felt like an open wound when Kayamika returned, her eyes swollen and her lips cracked from silence. The pastor's wife, Mummy Pastor Rose, noticed her walking in slowly, with her wrapper loose and stained. "Kayamika, what happened?" she asked, running toward her. But Kayamika said nothing. She simply handed over her Bible and collapsed in the older woman's arms. Word spread quickly. Church members gathered, whispering with concern but not judgment. Damien was the first among them to sit beside her on the pew she now slept on. He brought warm gari and egusi soup in a plastic bowl, watching her eat in silence, every spoonful a reminder that someone still cared. The pastor called a closed-door meeting. "The house of God is a refuge for the broken," he said, his voice trembling. "Let no one drive her out. Let no one shame her here." And that was how Kayamika became a church resident, sleeping on a wooden bench, covering herself with her old wedding veil at night, whispering psalms into the silence. But Obinna wasn't done with his cruelty. Days later, he showed up at the church with two of his friends, laughing as they sat under the mango tree near the compound's edge. "How is Madam Pastor's wife?" he asked loudly. "Has her Jesus paid bride price yet?" His friends burst into laughter. Damien stood nearby, sweeping the steps, but his fists clenched. The pastor came out and asked them to leave. Obinna stood, clapped sarcastically, and said, "You people think prayers build houses? Keep deceiving yourselves." Kayamika watched from inside the sanctuary, tears streaming down as she realized some men don't just stop loving. They begin to hate the purity they once depended on. Her humiliation had gone from private to public, and yet all she had left was her faith. One day she sat at the altar alone, whispering, "Lord, I have nothing. No home, no husband, no peace. But I still have you. Don't leave me too. Behind her, Damien entered silently, sat on the other side of the altar, and whispered his own prayer. Father, if you ever lift me, please remember her. Mama Grace came to visit, heartbroken that her daughter was now sleeping on a church bench, but Kayamaka held her mother's hands and said, Mama, I'm safer here than in his house. The two women wept and prayed together, as villagers mocked them. This one Don turned church property, they whispered. From wife to homeless Holy Ghost secretary. But something strange happened during one of the Sunday services. As Kayamaka stood to lead a prayer, her voice broken, yet deep, the entire congregation fell silent. There was power in her pain, clarity in her brokenness. When she declared, the same people who mock you today will queue behind your testimony. Even the skeptical aunties said, Amen. She began to feel her spirit strengthening, like God was adding bricks to her soul. It wasn't deliverance by fire. It was healing by grace. She had lost everything. But in that sanctuary, God was rebuilding her quietly and watching everyone who laughed take notes unknowingly. It came on a rainy Tuesday. The thunder rumbled like drums in the sky, and the zinc roof of the church trembled as fat droplets hammered down. Kayamaka had just finished wiping down the wooden benches and was preparing to read Psalm 27 again when Mummy Pastor entered the chapel, holding a brown envelope. Obina dropped this off, she said softly. Kayamaka's hands trembled as she took it. Inside were divorce papers, official, signed, and notarized. No warning, no explanation. Only a single sentence scribbled on a torn piece of paper. You and your God can marry each other now. For a moment, the world spun. Kayamaka's chest tightened, as if she were being suffocated by invisible hands. Mummy Pastor hugged her tightly, and both women wept without words. The betrayal wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. She had vowed before God and man, and now man had torn it in half and spat on the remains. It wasn't just a marriage ending. It was the last tie to dignity being burned publicly. The next day, Obina made sure the whole village heard. At Mom and Ketchi's canteen, he laughed loudly while eating pepper soup with friends. She day pray for marriage restoration, but me I don't move on, he said, pounding the table. The Bible no day do me anymore. Ngozi was beside him, flaunting a new weave, adjusting her waist beads every few seconds. She mocked Kayamaka too, imitating her prayer posture, and the table roared with laughter. Back at the church, the women whispered. Some blamed Kayamaka. She too day carried church for head, they said. Man no day like too much holiness. Others pitied her, saying, she for don ben small nah. But Kayamaka sat in the sanctuary, reading Isaiah 50:4 aloud. For your Maker is your husband, the Lord Almighty is his name. Those words pierced her soul. She didn't need pity. She needed presence. God's presence. In the echo of her heartbreak, she discovered a new depth of communion, one she never knew, even when married. It was the beginning of something sacred, but no one around her could see it yet. The pastor called for a special prayer service the following Sunday. He made Kayamaka sit in the front row, wrapped in a new lace wrapper gifted by the women's group. Damien led worship, but his eyes kept drifting to her, not in romance, but in spiritual awe. He saw a woman broken but glowing. When the pastor announced, this woman was rejected, but she has become the cornerstone, the church erupted in applause. But outside the gates, Obina stood in his car, smirking. Cornerstone my foot, he muttered. She's finished. But heaven was not done writing. The divorce papers had ended her marriage, yes, but they had also freed her for the destiny about to unfold. And as the rain continued that night, soaking the world in newness, Kayamaka sat at the altar again, this time whispering, Lord, if this is truly the end, let it be the end you build from. It had been 3 weeks since the divorce papers arrived, but for Kayamaka, the sting hadn't dulled. It had only settled in deeper, wrapping around her identity like smoke she couldn't shake. But God had not allowed her to starve. Mama Grace had returned to the village with some cassava, and the women's fellowship often slipped extra portions of rice into her food bag after evening prayer. Still, Kayamaka wanted to earn something with her hands, not out of pride, but out of principle. So She took a basin of okra and peppers to the local market to sell. It wasn't much, but it was honest. That morning, she wrapped herself in her only decent okra, tied her scarf tightly, and set out with her basin balanced on her head and her Bible in her purse. As she walked into the marketplace, several women turned to look. Some smiled politely, others whispered, "She's still carrying that Bible like it's a wedding ring." But Kayamaka focused her eyes forward and said a quiet prayer under her breath. "Lord, bless the work of my hands, even if it is little." By noon, she had only sold a handful of items when a loud car horn disrupted the air. Everyone turned. A flashy Lexus RX parked by the market entrance, music blaring, tinted windows rolling down slowly like a Nollywood scene. Out stepped Ngozi, in a glistening red jumpsuit with long Brazilian hair and matching gold heels that clicked like pride itself. And right behind her, adjusting his designer sunglasses, was Obina, her ex-husband, the same man who once mocked Lagos girls for being fake. Now, he was the definition of what he hated, and he had come to flaunt it. "Look who's still selling okra," Ngozi laughed, loud enough for the nearest traders to hear. "Madam Prayer Warrior has entered pepper business." Obina chuckled and added, "No worry, that her Bible goes soon teach her how to make millions." The market women joined in the laughter, not out of wickedness, but because shame is often louder than compassion in public places. Kayamika's hands trembled as she bent over her basin. She tried to smile to ignore them, but the tears came anyway, soaking into the fabric of her blouse. She stood there, frozen in a sea of mockery, as Obina kissed Ngozi on the cheek and tossed N5000 to a random vegetable seller just beside Kayamika. "Not everyone here is a spiritual beggar," he said. The crowd roared again. In that moment, it wasn't the laughter that broke Kayamika. It was the realization that she was truly alone. No one came to her defense. No one said, "Leave her alone." Even those who once prayed with her were now silent, afraid to be mocked too. But Kayamika didn't retaliate. She didn't curse or shout. Instead, she slowly packed her unsold okra back into the basin, wiped her eyes, and walked away. As she turned the corner toward the church compound, she whispered one sentence that carried the weight of her soul. "They are not mocking me. Lord, they are mocking you. Please, don't let it end like this." And heaven, silent as ever, continued watching the stage that was slowly being set for the kind of reversal that only divine hands could script. That night, Kayamika couldn't sleep. Not just because the wooden pew under her back was stiff or that mosquitoes whined endlessly around her ears. It was the humiliation at the market that haunted her like a broken record. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the church, her Bible clutched tightly to her chest like a baby. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand. I gave you everything. My marriage, my youth, my dreams, and this is what I get." She waited for a sign, maybe a breeze, a whisper, anything. But nothing came. Only silence, and the croaking of distant frogs outside. Around midnight, the door creaked open, and Damien stepped in quietly. He didn't speak. He simply placed a steaming flask of jollof rice and a sachet of pure water beside her bench, nodded respectfully, and left. Kayamika sat up slowly, tears pouring down her cheeks as she opened the flask. "You sent me food through someone who still believes in me," she said aloud. "That means you haven't left." And in that moment, something shifted, not around her, but within her. A fragile hope began to flicker again. But even the house of God wasn't immune to gossip. Some of the younger choir girls began whispering. "Is she planning to live here forever? Maybe she wants to trap Bro Damien." Others began to treat her like a permanent guest, not a fellow believer. During evening rehearsals, her bench was sometimes taken, her food in the church kitchen mistakenly eaten, her name left out of the duty rosters. Yet she endured it all without lashing out. One evening, she caught two ushers giggling as they passed her. "From wife to widow of faith," one said sarcastically. She smiled at them and said nothing. But that night, as she cleaned the altar before vigil, she whispered, "Lord, I am still your servant. Even if I sweep your house forever, let it not be in vain." The pastor noticed her growing thinner, quieter, yet more radiant. "There's something strange about your pain," he told her after a Tuesday prayer meeting. "It's birthing something bigger than you can see." Kayamika smiled, but didn't reply. How could she explain that even though she was broken, her roots were somehow growing deeper? Obina still visited sometimes, not to take her back, but to flaunt his newfound freedom. He once came on a Sunday morning in a tight shirt and chains around his neck, stood outside the church gate during praise and worship and shouted, "Can your God bless you with a car?" The security guard tried to chase him off, but Kayamika stopped them. "Let him stay," she said calmly. "If God could feed Elijah with ravens, he can speak through ridicule." Obina laughed and drove away, spinning dust behind him. But what he didn't realize was that every time he mocked her, he added a brick to the foundation God was laying. Every insult became mortar in the walls of her becoming. She didn't know how or when it would all change. She just knew it would. And so every night, she lay on that bench, bruised but not broken, whispering scriptures into the darkness. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. The only question was, which morning? It was during the church's annual revival that everything shifted. The small zinc roof building was packed full that Sunday night, every bench taken, plastic chairs squeezed into corners, people even standing outside to catch fragments of fire falling from the pulpit. The guest preacher had just finished a sermon titled, "The Stone the Builders Rejected." As the choir began to sing softly behind him, the man turned suddenly and pointed toward Kayamika, who sat in the third row with her Bible open on her lap and her head bowed. "You," he said firmly. "Yes, you in the blue wrapper." Kayamika looked up slowly, confused. "Stand," he instructed. The church fell silent. Whispers flew. "What's happening? Is she in trouble?" But the man of God stepped forward and said, "They mocked you. They said you were finished. They called your faith useless. But I see you sitting among princes. I see you walking beside power. The same people who disgraced you will kneel before you. And the same man who broke you will see you again and weep." The words exploded like thunder in the room. Gasps filled the air. Some people clapped, others simply stared. Kayamika stood still, her lips trembling. For a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. "Sir," she whispered me. The preacher nodded. "Yes. God has not forgotten the nights you slept in his house. He has not ignored the prayers you whispered with no one to hear. I don't know how or when, but daughter, you are being lifted." Mummy Pastor burst into tears, and Damien closed his eyes in silent agreement. It was as if the entire sanctuary had felt something shift, like the beginning of a new era. After the service, several women hugged her. Some said amen more out of shock than faith. Others looked uncomfortable, as though God had chosen the wrong person. But Kayamika didn't care. For the first time in months, she walked back to her bench not just with her Bible, but with a promise. And this time, it didn't feel like just a dream. It felt like prophecy. That night, long after everyone had left, Kayamika knelt at the altar, the oil of the prophecy still fresh in her spirit. Damien walked in again, but this time he didn't bring food. He brought a folded piece of paper. "This is from the university. I've been accepted to study law in Abuja," he said quietly. Kayamika smiled, her eyes still misty. "You're leaving?" Damien nodded. "For a while. But I'll be back. I believe your prophecy and mine are connected somehow." They prayed together, hand in hand, as the fan hummed softly overhead. Before he left, he turned to her and said, "When God starts lifting you, don't forget the people who saw your worth when you were sleeping on a bench." She laughed softly and replied, "How can I forget? I've etched everyone into the pages of my tears." As the church door shut behind him, Kayamika looked up at the ceiling again and whispered, "Lord, whatever you're about to do, don't delay." The days after the prophecy came with a strange quietness. Not the kind of silence that follows peace, but the kind that tests your belief in what you heard. Kayamika remained in the church, sweeping every morning, attending services, praying in the midnight hours, yet nothing visibly changed. The markets still mocked her. Her sandals were still torn. Her stomach still growled on certain nights. But her spirit had shifted. She began to walk with a quiet knowing, that something was about to turn, even if she couldn't explain how. But the real test came in the form of a man named Chief Nwokiti, a widower in his late 50s, rich and influential, known across the village for his red Mercedes and overflowing Ibada. He had lost his wife years ago and was now seeking someone quiet and submissive to remarry. He came to the church one Sunday and heard Kayamika's voice during worship. By the end of service, he approached the pastor privately, saying, "That's the kind of woman I need, prayerful, respectful, and already broken in by life." Mummy Pastor called Kayamika into her office later that evening with careful excitement. "My daughter, this might be your miracle. He's rich, God-fearing, and willing to take you as you are." Kayamika listened silently. She didn't want to seem ungrateful. After all, everyone knew Chief Nwokiti, a man with land, workers, and a growing business. He wouldn't beat her, they said. He would give her peace, wealth, and redemption. She prayed about it for 2 nights, then a third. On the 4th night, she opened her Bible and landed on Isaiah 30 verse 1. "Woe to the rebellious children that take counsel, but not of me." Her heart froze. She didn't know why, but something inside whispered, "This is not your door." Still, when the chief arrived again the following Sunday, bearing a bag of rice and an envelope of money for her mother, Kayamika was torn. Mama Grace cried with joy. The women's fellowship rejoiced. But Kayamika, she hesitated. On the 5th night, she went into the sanctuary alone, knelt at the altar, and said aloud, "Lord, if I say no, and I miss my only chance, please carry the blame. But if I say yes and step outside your will, I won't survive it." The next morning, she declined the proposal. She didn't say why. She simply smiled and said, "Sir, I'm grateful, but I must follow the peace I have." The chief didn't take it well. He felt insulted. "You, a church bench woman, rejecting me? You must not know who I am." Within days, the story spread like fire. "She rejected a millionaire, the village echoed. "She's waiting for Holy Spirit to marry her." Obina heard about it and laughed so hard he choked on his beer. "This one has gone mad finally. Church Don enter her brain like fuel." Ngozi posted cryptic Facebook quotes aimed at her. "Some women are too proud to be rescued. Now so them go die inside humility." But through all the shame, Kayamika stood still. It wasn't about pride. It was about peace. And though she didn't know what was ahead, she had chosen to trust the God who had already let her lose everything, and promised that in that loss, he would build something that eyes had not seen. Years passed like breath. Quietly, steadily, faithfully. Damien had gone off to Abuja to study law, and though his absence left a space in Kayamika's life, she never once felt abandoned. He sent letters through the church secretary once every few months, handwritten updates that came folded in brown envelopes, sealed with masking tape and scented faintly with rain. "I'm now in 300 level," one read. "Still remembering you. Still believing your prophecy is bigger than we both imagined." Those letters were the closest thing to companionship Kayamika had. She held them like scripture, often rereading them when the days grew dry and her faith felt shaky. In one letter, Damien mentioned he had joined a Christian law fellowship. In another, he spoke about attending his first political debate. "They said I speak like someone who has been through war," he wrote. "Maybe that's what makes you and I different. We know what it means to cry and still believe." And somehow, those words carried her through seasons of silence. Back home, not much had changed, at least not externally. Kayamika still lived in the small back room beside the church. She still cleaned the altar every morning before sunrise, still sang softly during intercession, still tucked her Bible under her wrapper when going to the market to avoid fresh mockery. But internally, she was a different woman, stronger, sharper. Her prayers carried weight now, not from how loud they were, but from the pain they came from. When she prayed for other women's marriages, they listened differently. When she laid hands on the sick, even the cynical ones paused. Something about her suffering had fermented into authority. And the pastor began giving her responsibilities, leading prayer chains, mentoring young girls, overseeing night vigils. She was no longer the broken woman hiding in the pews. She had become a spiritual pillar, the kind of woman people admired, yet didn't fully understand. Obinna, meanwhile, was slowly unraveling. The Lagos contract he had boasted about collapsed. The car he flaunted was repossessed. Ngozi, once the queen of his mockery, had left him for a wealthier businessman in Port Harcourt. He still walked around the village with pride, but his clothes were no longer new, and his eyes now carried a weariness he tried to mask with pride. He saw Kayamaka once during a funeral, dressed in a simple white gown with a blue scarf, standing by the choir. She didn't notice him, or maybe she did and didn't care. But he noticed her. How graceful she looked. How calm. How glowing. Something inside him twisted, not from love, but from regret. Yet his ego wouldn't let him speak. "Not prayer bleach your face," he told his friends, trying to laugh it off. But that night, he lay awake wondering how the same woman he once called useless was now the only person who looked untouched by time. Eventually, the winds shifted. After nearly 5 years of serving in the church, Kayamaka received an unexpected invitation from a pastor's wife in Lagos, someone who had once attended a vigil in the village and been deeply moved by her prayers. "We run a Christian women's support network here," the woman wrote. "We would love to offer you a place to stay and work. Nothing fancy, but you'll be safe. And maybe seen." Kayamaka prayed for 2 weeks. She fasted. She sought counsel. Then, with a small nylon bag, her Bible, and Mama Grace's blessing, she left for Lagos in a rickety bus, not knowing she was walking into the city of her unveiling. Life in Lagos was not easy. The city moved fast, spoke loudly, and consumed the slow-hearted. But Kayamaka adjusted. She was hired as a cook and maid in a modest household where she swept, washed, and prepared meals for a family of 4. Her madam was kind, but strict. The children mocked her accent. Yet she kept smiling. And every night, long after the family slept, she knelt on the cold kitchen floor and whispered, "Lord, let my feet find purpose in this city." Sometimes she was treated like air. Sometimes like dirt. Once, the madam's friend came over and whispered, "This your maid too holy. She go soon join convent." The house laughed. Kayamaka bowed and left the room. In her small corner behind the kitchen, she pasted scriptures on the wall with masking tape. "He raises the poor from the dust. Those who trust in the Lord shall not be put to shame." Those were not just verses to her, they were survival. Her pay was small, but she saved faithfully. Her clothes were few, but she washed them with care. And she never missed Sunday service at a nearby RCCG branch, where she sat quietly at the back until one day, the head usher overheard her singing and asked her to join the choir. Little by little, her life began to bloom again. Not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently, like a flower forcing itself through cracked concrete. And then came the rally, the day that changed everything. She had gone to deliver jollof rice and water for the church's women's group who volunteered at a political rally in Acadia. She wasn't interested in politics. She barely knew who was running. But as she stood at the edge of the crowd, passing out water sachets, she heard a voice, commanding, clear, familiar. Her heart stopped. She turned. And there he was, on the makeshift stage, in a sharp blue caftan, holding a microphone and speaking like thunder wrapped in grace. Damien, her old friend, now a Senate candidate. She dropped the tray she was holding and covered her mouth, breath caught in her throat. Damien paused mid-sentence, eyes scanning the crowd. Their eyes met, and in that one moment, 5 years of pain, prayer, and prophecy collided, not in fireworks, but in silent, stunned recognition. The journey was far from over, but destiny had just made eye contact. The sun was already dipping when Kayamaka finished, folding the last food flasks into the women's ministry truck. The crowd was dispersing from the rally, but her heart had not returned to normal since she locked eyes with Damien. Her hands were shaking as she dusted her wrapper, not from fear, but from something deeper. Awe, maybe. Disbelief. Or maybe it was the pain of 5 years of silence collapsing into 1 second of eye contact. She tried to hide among the volunteers, blending into the background like she always did. But destiny doesn't forget faces, especially those shaped by fire. Before she could slip away, someone tapped her shoulder. Sister. Sister Yamaka. She turned slowly. Damien stood there, taller, older, more confident, but with the same warm eyes she remembered from the village altar. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "Is it really you?" Kayamaka smiled, nodded once, and for the first time in years, allowed tears to fall without wiping them. Damien didn't touch her. He simply stood in silence, as though words would cheapen the moment. You said you'd come back," she whispered. He nodded. "And you waited." They found a quiet corner behind the stage, away from campaign posters and prying eyes. There, between half-empty water bottles and discarded megaphones, they caught up on 5 years of pain and perseverance. Damien listened with clenched fists as Kayamaka told him everything. The betrayal, the slap, the laughter at the market, the nights on the bench. "And yet," she said softly, "God preserved me. I thought he was punishing me at first. But now I know. He was pruning." Damien's eyes welled with tears, but he wiped them quickly. "Kayamaka, I carried your story with me. Every class I passed in law school, every speech I gave, I imagined I was talking to you. I told God that if he ever lifted me, I'd come back and look for the woman who slept on his altar." She laughed softly, still stunned. "And now you're running for Senate." He chuckled. "That's the plan. But I've realized something. I'm not here just for politics. I'm here because heaven doesn't forget intercessors." They exchanged phone numbers, promising to meet again properly. But even as they parted that day, something had changed. The air around Kayamaka felt different, like the clouds had shifted, like her obedience had found its echo. When she returned to the household where she worked, she said nothing to her madam. But in the quiet of her tiny room that night, she pulled out her Bible and found a note Damien had once written in the margin back in the village. "Sometimes God delays visibility so your light doesn't fall into the wrong hands." She smiled, ran her fingers over the ink and said aloud, "Maybe my visibility has finally begun." She didn't know what the future held, whether this was friendship, destiny, or something still unfolding. But she knew this. Her past had not buried her. It had planted her. And slowly, without applause, she was starting to bloom. Days turned into weeks, but the light that had ignited in Kayamaka during that rally never dimmed. Damien began visiting often, not in secret, but quietly, respectfully. He would stop by her church after Sunday services, sometimes sharing a word, sometimes just sitting beside her during worship. Lagos was loud, but their friendship remained hushed, intimate, wrapped in a mutual reverence. At first, Kayamaka was hesitant. She had lived too long among mockers to trust good intentions easily. But Damien was patient. He didn't rush her. He asked questions about her dreams, not her past. And when he spoke about politics, he asked her what she thought, like her opinion mattered, like her years of prayer had equipped her to see beyond noise. "You don't need to wear a suit to have vision," he once told her, handing her a notepad. "Write again, teach again, speak again. You've poured into others for so long. Now it's time you stepped out too." Kayamaka began mentoring young girls in her church, not officially, but word spread quickly. "Auntie Kayamaka, can I talk to you? Auntie, please pray with me. Auntie, what do I do if he slaps me like your ex did you?" Her room became a therapy center, her story a lifeline. She didn't have money, but she had wisdom. And sometimes that was more powerful. Damien watched from a distance, often smiling to himself. He began inviting her to campaign strategy meetings, not as a decoration, but as a voice. "They trust me because I sound intelligent," he said once, "but I trust you because you survived fire and came out glowing." Kayamaka's life didn't change in an instant. She still cooked meals, still swept floors. But her words carried weight now. Her silence commanded respect. And in time, the women's ministry began inviting her to speak, not just about heartbreak, but about restoration. She would stand before crowds and say, "I was laughed out of the market, but now I advise the man who might lead this nation." And the room would go quiet, because truth doesn't need a microphone to echo. The final sign of her rising came from an unexpected corner. One evening, while leaving church, she heard someone calling her name. She turned. It was Ngozi, dressed less extravagantly, face heavy with time. She looked Kayamaka over and said, "So it's true, they said you're now close to Senator Damien." Kayamaka didn't smile or gloat. She simply replied, "God restores." Ngozi's eyes dropped. "I envy your peace." It wasn't an apology, but it was enough. That night, Kayamaka lay on her small bed and whispered, "Lord, I don't need revenge anymore. I've outgrown it." Damien, now days away from final elections, called her often for advice. "They want to change my campaign slogan," he told her once. "What do you think of the people's servant?" She replied softly, "Only servants become kings." He paused and said, "You're the wisest woman I know." And for the first time in her life, Kayamaka didn't feel like the poor girl with a Bible. She felt like someone finally being seen for the treasure she had always been. Election day came like a whirlwind, sweeping the streets of Lagos with chants, flyers, banners, and the hopeful noise of change. Damien's name was everywhere, on radios in markets, on posters hanging across footbridges. Kayamaka stayed behind the scenes, as always, watching from the quiet corner of her church. But her heart prayed loudly. "Lord, if you lift this man, lift him for righteousness," she whispered during her midnight prayers. And when the results finally came in, a landslide victory, it wasn't just Damien who shouted with joy. The entire women's fellowship erupted in praise, knowing one of her own had helped build something bigger than revenge. Damien called Kayamaka first. He didn't scream or brag. He simply said, "God did it." And she replied, "He always finishes what he starts." She expected him to get busier now, to be swallowed by politics and meetings. But instead, he came closer. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when he asked to see her. They met at a garden near the lagoon. No crowd, no photographers, just wind and water. Damien stood awkwardly at first, clearing his throat, running his fingers along his suit pocket. "Kayamaka," he began, voice trembling slightly, "you once slept on a wooden bench in a village church. And I watched you pray when you had nothing left. I watched you wait when you could have taken shortcuts. I watched you carry dignity like a crown, even when people tried to strip it off you." She said nothing, her eyes already wet. He stepped closer. "I don't know what the future holds. Maybe more pain, maybe more battles. But I know one thing. I don't want to face it without the woman who taught me what real strength looks like." From his pocket, he pulled out a small, simple ring. "Will you be my wife?" For a moment, the world froze. The wind stopped. The noise of Lagos seemed far away. Kayamaka stared at him, her heart racing, her soul spinning. Not because of fear, but because she never imagined this would be her story. She thought her destiny ended at the market where they laughed at her, or on the bench where she wept into her Bible, or in the house where she cleaned floors. But now, standing here with a man who had become a symbol of hope for a nation, she realized something. Grace doesn't just restore. It rewrites. She nodded slowly, whispered yes, and let the tears fall freely. Damien slipped the ring on her finger, then held her hands as though they were altars. "Let the world mock again if they want," he said, smiling. "They won't recognize this version of you, but I always have." And in that moment, under the fading sun, a new chapter was born. Not loud, not fancy, but holy. The moment Kayamaka accepted Damien's proposal, whispers turned into storms. What was once a private engagement between two God-fearing souls became public fodder for political tabloids and social media trolls. Senator-elect to marry divorcee maid. One blog blared. Another. Damien Ease's mysterious fiancée exposed as ex-wife of car wash attendant. The backlash was swift and brutal, especially from Damien's political enemies, who saw her as a weak spot to exploit. Videos of Kayamaka sweeping the church compound surfaced. Images of her selling okro in the village market were shared, spliced with captions like, "Can this woman be First Lady material?" Damien's party advisors panicked. "Sir," one said during a heated strategy meeting, "you're a rising star. You don't need this baggage." You need a woman with polish, not a prayer warrior from the trenches. But Damien stood firm. I didn't choose her because she looked good on paper. I chose her because she didn't burn when life set her on fire. Kayamaka, however, felt the pressure. Even though she stayed quiet, the attacks wore her down. Some women in the campaign circle began distancing themselves from her, greeting her with fake smiles and forced hugs. She heard one of them whisper after a charity event, "We don't know what she's hiding." These quiet ones always come with village secrets. Kayamaka took it all to God. Every insult, every blog headline, every laugh. She would kneel in her small apartment, Bible pressed against her chest, and cry without words. She didn't ask for fame. She only wanted peace. But God, it seemed, had called her to a path where peace would be earned through fire. When she finally confronted Damien about the noise, she said, "Maybe you should pick someone who looks the part. I don't want to be the reason your legacy is mocked." Damien shook his head and held her hands firmly. "The part you play was written in heaven, not in public opinion. You were chosen, not hired." To silence the noise, Damien made a bold move. He hosted a live televised interview and brought Kayamaka with him. The host, a sharp-tongued media personality known for political takedowns, smirked at the intro. "So, you're marrying a woman from the slums. Some say that's noble. Others say it's reckless." Damien didn't flinch. When kings marry strength, kingdoms stand. "My fiancée may not have come from wealth, but she knows how to pray through storms. I'll take that over pedigree." Then the host turned to Kayamaka, expecting her to fumble. But she looked into the camera with calm eyes and said, "They laughed when I had nothing. They're laughing now that I have something. But when God writes your script, even your mockers buy tickets to watch." The room went silent. By the next day, the interview had gone viral. Hashtags changed from hashtag Damien should rethink to hashtag Bible wife and hashtag strength in scarves. Kayamaka didn't win everyone, but she had planted herself in the heart of a nation, not by fighting, but by standing with grace. News of the engagement spread quickly, but nowhere did it land harder than in Obina's ears. The same Obina who once stood at the church gate and laughed at Kayamaka for being married to her Bible, now sat in a one-room apartment in Onitsha, jobless, broke, and abandoned by Ngozi. Life had stripped him of every mask. The car was gone. The so-called business deals had turned to dust. Even his friends had vanished. The same village where he once paraded Kayamaka's pain like a trophy now whispered behind his back. And now, that same prayer warrior was on national television, radiant in a gold wrapper beside a rising senator, speaking with wisdom and calmness he never imagined she possessed. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. Then he saw her full name, Kayamaka Grace Okafor. His stomach turned. Shame came like a flood. But shame wasn't enough to kill his pride. It only twisted it. He told himself it was a fluke, that Damien had made a mistake. And then he decided to show up. It was at Damien's campaign Thanksgiving ceremony in their village. The community had organized a grand welcome, masquerades, dancers, mothers in uniformed Ankara, students waving flags. Kayamaka stood beside Damien, dressed simply but royally, as villagers who once avoided her now struggled to get close. "Auntie, remember me? I used to buy okra from you. You prayed for my sister that year, and now she's abroad." The drums roared louder as dignitaries arrived. And then, like a ghost in daylight, Obina appeared, dressed in faded jeans and a once white shirt, lurking at the edge of the gathering. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips dry. But it wasn't hunger that made him shake. It was realization. As he watched Kayamaka from afar, he remembered every slap, every insult, every laughter. His legs failed him, and he sat on the dusty ground, covering his face. "She was right," he muttered. "She was right, and I was blind." Kayamaka saw him. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowd. He didn't run. He didn't stand. He only bowed his head. Damien noticed too, but said nothing. That evening, after the event ended, Kayamaka walked toward where Obina sat alone under the mango tree beside the old church. "You came," she said softly. He didn't look up. "I had to," he whispered. "I had to see what I lost." Silence sat between them like a third person. Then he asked, "Do you hate me?" Kayamaka took a deep breath. "No. But I don't mourn you anymore." He wiped his eyes. "I mocked your faith. I mocked your God." She nodded. "And he still had mercy on me. That's the part you never understood." Before she turned to leave, he said, "Do you think he can still have mercy on me too?" She paused, looked at the church behind him, and said, "That door never closed. You just walked too far away from it." And then she walked away, leaving him in the same place where she once cried. But this time, it was him who wept, not her. The presidential campaign was a whirlwind, a storm of debates, interviews, sleepless nights, and prayerful mornings. Damien's party had nominated him as their flag bearer unexpectedly after the previous candidate stepped down due to health issues. Some said he wasn't ready. Others said his calm nature wouldn't survive the heat of national politics. But Kayamaka knew something the world didn't. Damien wasn't running by ambition. He was running by prophecy. And so was she. As First Lady candidate, her presence stirred both curiosity and controversy. She didn't wear designer gowns. She didn't use foreign accents. She still led prayers in small circles. But her authenticity caught fire. She doesn't pretend. One woman said in an interview, "When she says God will do it, you feel it in your bones." Every state they visited, people asked to hear her speak. And every time she held the microphone, she told the same story of a woman mocked for her faith, who slept on benches and was once called mad. "I didn't climb here," she'd say. "I was carried here by grace." Election night was tense. The entire nation held its breath. Power had become toxic in recent years, and many feared that even if Damien won, forces might try to rig him out. Kayamaka stayed in the prayer room at campaign headquarters, surrounded by intercessors. She didn't bite her nails or pace the floor. She just worshipped. "If you brought us this far," she said softly, "then finish what you started." The results came slowly. First one state, then another. Damien was leading, but barely. Then came the swing votes. A delay, then a technical glitch, then silence. But at 4:47 a.m., the final announcement came. Damien Ease, President-elect of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. The room exploded. People shouted. Cameras flashed. Reporters screamed. But Kayamaka, she fell to her knees and wept. Not from surprise, but from release. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not for the crown, but for the road that led here." In the inauguration weeks that followed, Kayamaka was dressed, styled, interviewed, analyzed, and scrutinized. But she remained the same, quiet, intentional, grounded. On Inauguration Day, as she walked into Ossa Rock hand in hand with Damien, the cameras zoomed in. Her head tie was simple, her smile soft, but in her other hand was her Bible, the same one she carried when she left Obina's house years ago. As she waved at the crowd, one reporter asked, "Ma, what do you say to young girls who have been mocked for being too spiritual?" Kayamaka turned slowly, her voice calm but powerful. "Let them laugh. One day they'll watch you rise, and the only thing you'll carry with you is what they mocked you for." And as the drums rolled and the anthem played, the nation rose to its feet. Not just for the president, but for the First Lady whose altar became a throne, not built with pride, but with prayers soaked in tears. Years passed, and the nation watched in wonder as Kayamaka redefined what it meant to be First Lady. She didn't chase foreign approval or wear crowns of vanity. Instead, she built prayer altars in slums, visited orphanages unannounced, and mentored girls who had no fathers, no hope, and no names. She carried herself with a quiet authority that silenced critics and shamed gossips. People began calling her Mama Restoration. But she never allowed the palace to wipe away her past. She kept her old Bible on her presidential bedside table. Every morning she knelt, not beside a church pew anymore, but beside presidential silk curtains, whispering to the same God she once cried to in the dark. She had risen, yes, but her roots were still in the fire that formed her. Her voice was still soaked in the memory of mockery. She remembered everything, especially the laughter, the bench, the slap, the okro, the storm. Because without them, there would have been no crown. One hot Wednesday afternoon, as the sun scorched Aso Rock gates, a security officer radioed in a report, "We have a man at the main gate barefoot, weak, says he wants to see the First Lady. Claims he knows her personally." Protocol dismissed it as nonsense. Many tried to gain access through false familiarity. But the guard insisted, "This one he's not lying. He's not pretending. He's broken." When the name Obinenwankwo was finally mentioned, Kayamaka, in the middle of a high-level briefing, froze. Her heart didn't race in fear. It simply paused, in reverence of how full-circle grace could be. She requested that he be allowed in, not through the staff corridor, not through a security interrogation, but straight into her private garden, where she often sat with the poor. Minutes later, Obinna was ushered in. He was thin, unshaven, and visibly frail. His eyes were hollow, not just from hunger, but from the weight of memory. And when he saw her, radiant in a simple ivory gown, seated calmly beneath a rose tree, he fell to his knees without a word. Kayamaka didn't rush to speak. She let the silence wash over them. He sobbed like a child. "I came to say, I'm sorry," he stammered, his forehead pressed to the marble floor. "I have nothing left. Nothing. Ngozi took everything. I thought I was winning. But every step I took away from you was a step deeper into my own destruction." She remained seated, her hands folded on her lap, watching him. After a while, she spoke softly. "You told me to marry my Bible. You laughed when I left with nothing but it. Today it brought me here. And you? You brought yourself here." He nodded through the tears. "I deserve nothing. I don't even know why I came." She stood slowly, walked to him, and crouched beside him. "I'm not your wife anymore. I'm not your enemy either. I am a woman who forgave you years ago, not because you asked, but because I needed to be free." Then she asked the guards to bring him food, clothes, and a small stipend. She didn't offer him a palace room, but she offered him something deeper, dignity, the very thing he once stripped from her. The presidential chapel was silent, the kind of silence that made even marble floors seem sacred. It was the 5th anniversary of Damien's presidency, and Kayamaka had chosen to mark it not with galas or speeches, but with a midnight Thanksgiving, just her, Damien, and a few ministers. She walked into the altar area, barefoot, dressed in a plain white wrapper and scarf, holding the same Bible she once carried out of Obinna's house all those years ago. Damien stood in the corner, watching her with eyes full of reverence. He had grown too, not just politically, but spiritually. Power had not changed him. Kayamaka's presence had grounded him. As the worship filled the room, Kayamaka stepped forward, placed the Bible on the altar, and knelt. "Father," she began, her voice trembling, "I've been rich and poor, mocked and praised, slapped and honored, but through it all, you never left." A hush fell. Even angels, it seemed, leaned closer. She began to pray, not for herself, but for girls like her, for the broken, for the rejected, for the mocked. May my story remind them that silence is not defeat, that pain is not the end, that even when you sleep on a bench, heaven is not asleep. Her tears fell freely. Damien knelt beside her, head bowed. The ministers followed. Soon, everyone in that grand presidential chapel, with chandeliers and gold, was on the floor, weeping before a God who had turned ashes into royalty. The weight of what Kayamaka had carried, her suffering, her waiting, her obedience, filled the room like incense. And as she finished her final words, "Let my life remain a reminder that God sees, even when the world laughs," a divine stillness settled. It was not just the end of a prayer. It was the closing of a chapter, the final sealing of a testimony written in fire, watered with tears, and lifted by grace.
When she rose to her feet, she looked around the room, then at Damien, and then up at the ceiling, where a soft beam of light pierced through the stained glass. She smiled, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for heaven. And in that moment, it became clear, her crown had never been the seat in Aso Rock. Her throne was never the villa. Her legacy was never her title. Her crown was endurance. Her throne was resilience. And her title was evidence. As the sun began to rise over the city, and birds began to sing again. Kayamika walked slowly out of the chapel, Bible still in hand, her feet quiet, her spirit louder than ever. Somewhere in the distance, Obina sat on a bench, eating the food she gave him. And in that soft morning light, it was clear. The one who was once mocked for her faith had become the living proof that grace doesn't rush. It arrives. And when it does, even mockers are made to kneel. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.